It wasn't the life I had envisioned for myself, not at 68, and certainly not without Henry by my side. For 40 years we had shared everything, our home, our dreams, and our love. He had been my anchor, my companion, my greatest source of inspiration. But when he passed 5 years ago, it was as if the world had lost all its color. I had tried to find my footing after he died, throwing myself into my art, hoping to capture some of the vibrancy that had once fueled my life. But with every brushstroke, I felt further from myself. Eventually, I stopped painting altogether, packing away the easels, the canvases, and the paints that once gave me so much joy. I hadn't touched them in years. That's how I ended up here, in this quiet retirement community nestled in the hills. It was a beautiful place, really, a haven of manicured gardens, stone pathways, and small, elegant cottages. But beauty felt distant to me now, like an echo of something I could no longer reach. I spent my days walking through the gardens or sitting by the large windows of my cottage, staring at the view that had once brought me peace. It wasn't until I noticed Thomas, the quiet groundskeeper who tended the community gardens, that I began to feel something stir inside me again. At first, I paid him little mind. He was younger, perhaps in his mid-40s, and though he seemed kind enough, I wasn't looking for company. I was content, or so I told myself, to live out my days in solitude, surrounded by the memories of what had been. But as the weeks passed, I found myself watching him as he worked in the flower beds near my house. There was a gentleness to the way he handled the plants, as if he understood their rhythm, their need for care. He moved with quiet purpose, his hands deftly pulling weeds, planting new life, coaxing beauty from the earth. One afternoon, as I sat on my porch, sketchpad in hand but uninspired, he paused in his work to wipe his brow. Our eyes met briefly, and for the first time I really saw him, not just as a figure in the distance, but as a person. There was something in his gaze, a quiet strength that reminded me of someone I used to know. Perhaps it was Henry, or perhaps it was a reflection of my own loneliness. I didn't expect much from our first conversation. He was just a gardener, after all, and I was just a widow passing through the autumn of her life. But that day something shifted. We spoke about the flowers he was planting, roses, peonies, and a few rare blooms I couldn't quite remember the names of. He spoke with such reverence for the earth, for the way things grew, that I found myself captivated by his words. From that day forward, I began looking for him during my walks. We would exchange pleasantries, brief conversations about the weather or the state of the gardens, but I felt a connection forming, one that surprised me with its quiet intensity. I hadn't felt this drawn to anyone in years, and it frightened me. The first time I truly noticed him, really noticed him, was on a cool afternoon in late spring. I had taken my usual walk through the gardens, as I did every morning, enjoying the scent of blooming flowers and the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. I saw Thomas hunched over a patch of dahlias, his hands deep in the soil. There was something about the way he worked that caught my attention, a kind of calm, deliberate care that I hadn't expected to find in a man who, by all appearances, was just the groundskeeper. I paused by the rose bushes, watching him work for a moment longer than I should have. His movements were steady, precise, and I could tell that he was someone who understood the earth in a way that few people did. He wasn't just planting flowers, he was nurturing them, coaxing them to bloom in the same way one might encourage a shy child to speak. It had been a long time since I had felt any kind of spark, any desire to connect with someone. After Henry's death, I had closed myself off, retreating into my art, only to find that even my paintings had lost their color. But standing there, watching Thomas work, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in years. Curiosity, perhaps, or maybe it was something deeper. I made my way over to him, unsure of what I would say. When he looked up and smiled, it was a small, polite smile, but there was a warmth in his eyes that made me feel, for the first time in a long time, seen. "Good morning," I said, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. I had grown so used to the silence of my own company that speaking to someone else felt foreign. "Good morning," he replied, wiping his hands on his pants. "It's a beautiful day for gardening, isn't it?" "It is," I agreed, glancing at the flowers he had planted. "Those dahlias are lovely. My husband used to plant them in our garden. He had a way with flowers." "I can tell," Thomas said, glancing around at the other flowers surrounding my cottage. "You have a beautiful garden." "It's not mine," I said quickly. "I mean, I didn't plant it. It was here when I moved in." He nodded, not pressing further, but I could tell he understood the meaning behind my words. The garden might have been beautiful, but it was not mine. It was a borrowed beauty, just like the life I had been living since Henry's death. Thomas and I continued to exchange pleasantries for several weeks. Each time we spoke, I found myself lingering longer, listening more closely to his voice, to the stories he shared about his work with plants and his time living in other parts of the country. He had the kind of patience and steadiness that one didn't often find in younger men. There was no rush in the way he spoke, no need to fill every silence with noise, and I appreciated that more than I could say. He wasn't like Henry, who had been a talker, constantly filling our days with conversations and grand plans. Thomas was different, quieter, more reflective, but there was something about that quiet that drew me to him, something in his eyes that spoke of a depth of experience, perhaps even pain, that I could sense without him ever needing to say it. One afternoon, as I sat on the porch sketching the distant hills, I watched Thomas working near the flower beds. He moved with a graceful efficiency, and I realized how much I had come to enjoy his presence, even from afar. It had been a long time since I had felt that kind of comfort in someone's company, especially in the company of a man. Since Henry's death, I had closed that part of my heart off, convinced that love or even companionship was no longer meant for me. But watching Thomas, I couldn't help but wonder if I had been wrong. It was an unexpected storm that changed everything. The weather had been warm and clear all day, but by late afternoon, dark clouds rolled in over the hills, bringing with them a sudden gust of wind and the smell of rain. I was sitting by the window, watching the storm build, when I saw Thomas hurriedly gathering his tools from the garden. Without thinking, I grabbed an umbrella and rushed outside. By the time I reached him, the rain was already starting to fall in heavy drops, soaking through my clothes. "You should come inside," I shouted over the sound of the wind. Thomas looked up, surprised to see me there. He hesitated for a moment before nodding, grabbing the last of his tools and following me back to the porch. By the time we reached the door, we were both drenched. "Thank you," he said, shaking the rain from his hair as he stepped inside. "I wasn't expecting the storm to come so quickly." "Neither was I," I replied, handing him a towel. "You should stay until it passes. It looks like it's going to be a bad one." Thomas nodded, accepting the towel gratefully. As he dried off, I realized how strange it felt to have someone else in the house. Since Henry had passed, the cottage had been so quiet, so still. Now, with Thomas standing in the living room, dripping rainwater onto the hardwood floors, it felt alive again. I motioned toward the kitchen. "Would you like something to drink? Tea? Coffee?" "Tea would be nice," he said, his voice soft. As I moved around the kitchen, preparing the tea, I felt a tension building inside me. It wasn't unpleasant. It was more like an anticipation, a quiet excitement that I hadn't felt in years. The rain pounded against the windows, and the air inside the house felt thick with the storm's energy. When I brought the tea to the living room, Thomas was standing by the window, watching the rain. He turned as I approached, offering a small smile of thanks as he took the cup from my hands. "I don't usually come inside people's homes," he said after a moment, his gaze returning to the storm outside. "I'm more comfortable out there in the garden." "You spend a lot of time in the garden," I said, sitting down on the couch. "It must be nice being so close to the earth." He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's the only thing that makes sense to me sometimes. When life feels chaotic, the garden has a rhythm that never changes. It's peaceful." I understood what he meant. After Henry's death, I had found solace in the predictable routines of my daily life: the tea in the morning, the walk in the afternoon, the quiet evenings spent watching the sun set behind the hills. But that solace had also turned into isolation, and as I sat there with Thomas, I realized how much I had been missing. For a long time we sat in silence, listening to the rain. The storm had knocked out the power, and the only light in the room came from the flickering candles I had placed on the table. There was a warmth between us now, something unspoken but deeply felt. I could feel the pull of his presence, the quiet strength of his company, and I knew that something had shifted between us. "Do you ever miss it?" I asked, breaking the silence. "Being around people?" Thomas was quiet for a moment, his brow furrowing in thought. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But I've gotten used to being alone. It's easier that way." I nodded, understanding all too well what he meant. "I used to be surrounded by people," I said quietly. "My husband was always bringing people into our lives, artists, musicians, dreamers. But after he died, it all went away. I went away." Thomas turned to me, his expression softening. "You haven't gone anywhere, Margaret." His words surprised me. I wasn't sure if it was the way he said my name or the sincerity in his voice, but for the first time in years, I felt truly seen. I looked up at him, and in that moment, I realized that the distance between us, the distance I had felt for so long, wasn't so vast after all. "I don't know if I can come back," I whispered, my voice trembling with the weight of my emotions. "I don't know if I even know how." Thomas stepped closer, his hand reaching out to gently touch my arm. "You don't have to know how," he said softly. "You just have to take the first step." I looked up at him, my heart pounding in my chest. The air between us was thick with the tension of unspoken desire, of a connection that had been quietly building over the past few weeks. I could feel it in the way he looked at me, in the warmth of his hand on my arm, in the way my own body responded to his presence. Without thinking, I leaned forward, closing the distance between us. Our lips met in a soft, tentative kiss, and in that moment, the world seemed to fall away. There was no storm, no past, no future, only the quiet intensity of the connection we shared. When we finally pulled away, I felt breathless, my heart racing with a mixture of excitement and fear. I had never imagined that I could feel this way again, that I could want someone after so many years of loneliness. But now, standing there with Thomas, I realized that I had been wrong. He looked at me, his expression filled with both desire and uncertainty. "Margaret, I know," I said quickly, cutting him off before he could say anything more. "I know." I stepped back, suddenly overwhelmed by the intensity of my emotions. "I need time," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I need to think." Thomas nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Take all the time you need," he said quietly. "I'll be here." For the next few days, I avoided Thomas, not because I didn't want to see him, but because I didn't know how to face what had happened between us. The kiss had awakened something inside me, something I hadn't felt in years, and it terrified me. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel the warmth of his lips against mine, the quiet intensity of the connection we had shared. It was more than just desire. It was the possibility of something new, something I wasn't sure I was ready for. The guilt weighed heavily on me. How could I feel this way when Henry was still so much a part of me? How could I even think about moving on, about wanting someone else, when the love of my life was gone? I found myself walking through the gardens more often, hoping to clear my mind, but all I could think about was Thomas, the way he had looked at me, the way he had made me feel alive again. But with that feeling came fear, the fear of opening myself up again, of allowing myself to be vulnerable, of losing someone else. One afternoon, as I sat on a bench overlooking the rose garden, I found myself thinking about Henry. He had always been so full of life, so determined to live every moment to the fullest. He would have hated the way I had shut myself off from the world after his death. He would have wanted me to keep living, to keep loving, even if it meant loving someone else. But knowing that didn't make it any easier. The days passed slowly, each one dragging with the weight of indecision. I couldn't ignore the storm that had brewed within me since that night. It wasn't just about the kiss. It was about what it represented. I had lived in the comfort of my grief for so long that the idea of feeling something new, something alive, felt both exhilarating and terrifying. I avoided the garden where Thomas worked, afraid of what I might say or do if I saw him, but his presence lingered in my mind. I had shared something with him that I hadn't with anyone since Henry died, a part of myself I thought was gone. It was the part that craved connection, that longed for touch, for intimacy, for more than just the quiet company of my own thoughts. But what if this was wrong? What if it was just loneliness, playing tricks on my heart, tricking me into believing this was something real? I found myself walking around my cottage, touching the framed photographs of Henry on the mantel, wondering if he would understand. One afternoon, in a moment of weakness, I picked up the phone and called my sister, Claire. She was the only person who had been with me through every step of my grief, the one who knew my heart almost as well as I did. "Margaret?" Claire's familiar voice answered after just a few rings, her tone warm and reassuring. "It's been a while. How are you holding up?" I hesitated, unsure of how to explain what I was feeling. I'm not sure," I said quietly, my hand trembling as I held the phone. "I think I've done something I don't know how to make sense of." Claire didn't press me, instead, allowing the silence to stretch between us until I was ready to speak again. "There's someone," I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper, "someone who's made me feel things I haven't felt in a long time." Claire was quiet for a moment before speaking. "You don't need to be ashamed of that, Margaret. It's been years since Henry passed. You're allowed to feel something again." "I don't know if I can," I admitted, tears welling up in my eyes. "I feel like I'm betraying him, like I'm betraying everything we had." "Margaret, you loved Henry," Claire said gently, "and he loved you, but that doesn't mean your life has to stop. You still have so much life left to live, and Henry would have wanted you to be happy. I know he would." Her words sank in slowly, like raindrops on dry earth. I had always known that Henry would want me to keep living, to find happiness again, but knowing that and feeling it were two different things. Could I really open myself up to someone new? Was it possible to love again in a way that didn't diminish the love I had for Henry? "I'm scared," I confessed, my voice trembling. "I don't know if I'm ready." "Only you can decide that," Claire replied softly. "But don't close yourself off out of fear. Life doesn't stop just because we've lost someone. You deserve to feel alive again, Margaret." After we hung up, I sat in the quiet of my cottage, thinking about what Claire had said. I had spent so many years hiding behind my grief, using it as a shield against the world. But maybe it was time to let go of that shield. Maybe it was time to open myself up to the possibility of love again. The next morning, I woke with a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in years. The sun streamed through the window, casting a warm glow over the room, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel weighed down by the past. I decided to find Thomas. As I walked through the gardens, my heart pounded in my chest, nerves swirling in my stomach. I wasn't sure what I was going to say, but I knew I had to face him, had to face what was happening between us. When I found him, he was in the rose garden, his hands deep in the soil as he tended to the plants. He looked up when he saw me, and I could see the uncertainty in his eyes, the unspoken question of whether I had come to push him away or to welcome him back. "Margaret," he said softly, standing up and wiping his hands on his jeans, "I wasn't sure if I'd see you again." "I wasn't sure either," I admitted, my voice shaking slightly. "But I needed to think. I needed to figure out what all of this means." Thomas nodded, his expression serious but understanding. "I didn't want to push you," he said quietly. "I didn't want to make you feel like you had to do something you weren't ready for." "I know," I said, taking a deep breath, "but I've been thinking a lot about this, about us. And I realize that I've been hiding behind my grief for so long that I forgot what it felt like to really live, to feel something real." Thomas stepped closer, his eyes searching mine. "And now?" "And now," I said, my voice steady, "I think I'm ready to stop hiding." For a long moment we stood there, the weight of our unspoken emotions hanging between us. Then slowly I reached out and took his hand, my fingers trembling slightly as they touched his. "I don't know what this is," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "but I want to find out." Thomas smiled, a small, tender smile that made my heart ache in the best possible way. "So do I," he said softly. We stood there for a while, hand in hand, the late morning sun casting a warm glow over the garden. There was no rush, no urgency, just the quiet understanding that we were both taking a step into something unknown, something that had the potential to change both of our lives. Later that evening, I invited Thomas back to my cottage. The power had been restored, but I had kept the candles lit, their soft light filling the room with a warmth that mirrored the emotions swirling in my chest. As we sat on the couch talking quietly, I realized that this was more than just attraction. This was a connection, a deep, unspoken bond that had grown between us over the weeks, nurtured by our shared experiences, our shared loneliness. At some point, the conversation fell away, and we found ourselves sitting in comfortable silence. Thomas reached out, brushing a strand of hair behind my ear, his touch gentle and careful. I felt my heart quicken, but this time I didn't pull away. I leaned into his touch, allowing myself to feel the warmth of his hand against my skin, the quiet intimacy of the moment. "You're beautiful, Margaret," he whispered, his voice soft and sincere. I closed my eyes, letting his words wash over me. It had been so long since I had allowed myself to feel beautiful, to feel wanted, but in that moment with Thomas by my side, I felt alive again. We kissed, and this time it wasn't tentative or uncertain. It was full of the promise of something new, something real. As we embraced, I felt the last of my reservations melt away. I had spent so many years guarding my heart, afraid to let anyone in, afraid of what it might mean to feel again. But now, in Thomas's arms, I realized that love wasn't something to fear. It was something to embrace, something to cherish. That night we shared more than just a kiss. We shared a moment of true intimacy, a connection that went beyond the physical. It was a meeting of souls, a recognition of the loneliness we had both carried for so long, and a promise that we no longer had to carry it alone. In the weeks that followed, I found myself thinking less about the past and more about the future. The guilt I had felt over moving on from Henry had begun to fade, replaced by a quiet acceptance that life, as Claire had said, didn't stop with loss. It continued, sometimes in ways we couldn't predict, and sometimes with people we hadn't expected to find. Thomas and I continued to see each other, but there was no rush, no pressure to define what we were. We spent our days walking through the gardens, talking about everything and nothing, finding joy in the simple act of being together. One afternoon, as we sat by the window, watching the sunset over the hills, I realized that I had found something I hadn't known I was looking for. It wasn't just love, it was a sense of peace, a sense of being exactly where I was meant to be. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the hills, I turned to Thomas, a smile tugging at the corners of my lips. "I think I'm ready," I said quietly. "Ready for what?" he asked, his voice soft. "To paint again." Thomas smiled, reaching out to take my hand in his. "I've been waiting for you to say that." Together, we walked to my old art studio, the place that had once been filled with color and life. I hadn't stepped foot in it since Henry died, but now, with Thomas by my side, I felt a new sense of purpose. I picked up a paintbrush, the familiar weight of it in my hand comforting, and dipped it into the paint. As the brush touched the canvas, I felt a surge of emotion, joy, hope, love. It wasn't about recreating the past. It was about embracing the future, with all its uncertainties and possibilities, and as I painted, I knew that I wasn't just rediscovering my art. I was rediscovering myself.
I never saw it coming, honestly. Isn't that what people say? We go about our days and nights thinking we know who we are and the people we're closest to. We assume that after a certain age, those wild impulses, those sparks of reckless daring, have long faded away, like forgotten ashes in the bottom of a fire pit. But that weekend changed everything. Marion was my best friend. We'd grown up together, raised our children, and supported each other through the tragedies and triumphs that came with decades of friendship. Her husband, Howard, was a distant sort, always polite, rarely outspoken. He was just there, like the wallpaper. Over the years, I never thought much about him beyond the man who stood quietly by her side. Then they stayed at my home for a long weekend, and in the late hours after Marion had gone to bed, Howard and I shared moments I'd never anticipated, and I was left standing in the quiet shadow of my own actions. What followed was a spiral of feelings, decisions, and consequences that I never dreamed would come for a woman of my age. So here I am now, piecing it all together. The lies we tell ourselves, the hidden corners of our hearts that even we don't dare to look at until someone else sees them. What began as an innocent visit evolved into a story that would haunt me, unraveling secrets and truths, leading to choices that no one would have expected. I wonder if anyone can say they truly know themselves. Because after what happened that weekend, I'm no longer sure I can. The lake was calm, silver blue under the late afternoon light, and the leaves on the old oak trees had just started to turn. From my kitchen window, I watched a single orange leaf flutter to the ground, feeling the weight of the years it represented. I glanced at the old clock on my wall, its ticking the only sound in my small home. They'd be here soon. My best friend Marion and her husband Howard were coming for the weekend. an idea that had seemed delightful when she'd suggested it over the phone. "It's been too long since we've seen each other properly, Evelyn," she'd insisted. "Let's just have some time to breathe, talk, and relax without anything pulling us away." She was right, of course. Life had pulled us in different directions over the years, and though we called often enough, there was a distance between us that felt new. I couldn't quite explain it, and I wondered if she felt it too. But she sounded excited when we made our plans, and I wanted to believe this weekend could bridge that silent gap. Still, something in me was oddly hesitant. Part of me blamed the recent changes I'd seen in her. She was still my best friend, still the Marian who knew my childhood secrets, but she'd been growing into someone I struggled to recognize. Marian had always cared about appearances, but over the years, that side of her seemed to harden. She kept a perfect, magazine-ready home, threw elaborate parties for clients and friends, and told stories of her work as a gallery manager, as though it were a grand production. I knew she was proud of it all, and I didn't begrudge her that. But I couldn't help feeling that I no longer had a place in that world. The sound of tires crunching up my driveway pulled me back to the present. I straightened the napkin on the kitchen counter, heart fluttering in a way I hadn't expected. I walked to the front door just in time to see them emerge from the car, Marian looking as radiant as ever in her fitted jacket and pearl earrings, her short hair swept stylishly to one side. Howard climbed out from the driver's side, his graying hair cropped close, his glasses catching the light. "Evelyn." Marian's voice was warm as she came up the walk, her arms outstretched. I stepped forward, pulling her into a hug, feeling a familiar sense of comfort even as I noticed how thin she'd gotten. "Look at you," she said, pulling back and studying me. "It's like you never age." "Ha," I laughed, waving a hand, knowing full well the crow's feet had come to stay. "You're too kind." Howard smiled politely, standing a little behind her. He gave me a nod, then hugged me with a courteous awkwardness, the way you would an aunt you didn't see often. His face, though creased with age, was still handsome in a subtle, understated way. As we stood there exchanging pleasantries, I caught him watching me, his gaze softer, more lingering than I would have expected. We moved inside, where I poured glasses of iced tea, and we chatted about the drive up, about the changing colors of the leaves, about the weather and the quiet of my neighborhood. I led them to their guest room, showing Marian where she could hang her clothes in the closet, pointing out where I'd put fresh towels. "Oh, Evelyn, this is perfect," Marian sighed, looking out the window to the lake beyond. "I don't know how you can stand to live in such peace all the time. It's so restful." "It has its moments," I said, glancing back at Howard, who was quietly taking in the space, hands in his pockets. For a second, our eyes met, and there it was again, that same soft, lingering look, like he was seeing something about me that I couldn't quite understand myself. Dinner that evening was a simple affair. Roast chicken, a green salad, some of my mother's old recipes. We ate outside on the deck as the sun lowered, casting a warm orange glow over the lake. Marian was as chatty as ever, recounting stories from her work and updates on mutual friends. I could tell she had Howard's polite interest, though he'd heard these stories before. He chimed in occasionally, but mostly he just listened, his attention drifting more often than not. After the plates were cleared, Marian yawned and declared she'd had more than her fill. She stood, stretching her arms, and bid us good night, saying she'd see us both in the morning. I watched her disappear down the hall, feeling the silence settle between Howard and me. "Well," I said, trying to keep my voice light as I stacked plates, "I suppose I should call it a night too." But Howard held up his hand. "Here, let me help you clean up." He smiled, taking a few plates from my hands. "Oh no, really, you're a guest," I protested. He just shook his head and started collecting dishes from the table. "You can call me stubborn, but I'm not letting you do this alone." We moved in comfortable silence as we washed and dried dishes together. Every so often, I'd catch him glancing at me in that same way he had earlier, his gaze quietly assessing. Thoughtful. There was something unspoken in his look, something that made my heart beat faster despite myself. As the last dish was put away, I thanked him, feeling an odd reluctance to end the night. I poured us each a small glass of wine, and we moved back to the deck where the night had grown cool. Howard leaned against the railing, sipping slowly, his eyes distant. "This place," he said softly, "it's like something out of a memory. You're lucky, Evelyn." "Sometimes," I replied, watching his profile against the darkening sky. "Though I imagine it might feel quiet compared to the life you're used to." A small, sad smile crossed his lips. Quiet isn't always a bad thing. For a moment he seemed to be searching for words, his hand tightening on the glass. "Do you ever wonder how life might have been different, Evelyn, if you'd made other choices?" The question caught me off guard. "Of course," I said, setting my glass down and looking out at the lake. "Doesn't everyone? But we can't change the past." "No," he murmured. "But maybe we can make new choices." I turned to him, surprised by the look in his eyes, soft, almost wistful. It was then that I realized his hand was inches from mine on the railing, his fingers close enough that if I moved even slightly, they would touch. We lingered like that, the quiet settling around us, each of us bound by thoughts we couldn't say aloud. There was a tension between us I hadn't felt before. A charge I couldn't name but was suddenly aware of in a way that made my heart race. And just as quickly as it had come, he looked away, stepping back. "Good night, Evelyn," he said softly, his voice low. "Good night, Howard," I replied, barely able to meet his gaze. As he disappeared into the guest room, I stood there, feeling the cool night air, my heart beating louder than it had in years. I didn't sleep well that night, and I knew why. Memories, hazy and half-formed, drifted in and out of my mind. The glances we'd shared, the nearness of his hand on the railing, his low voice asking questions I hadn't expected. As the night wore on, I felt the weight of something I couldn't quite name, a stirring I hadn't felt in years, maybe decades. It felt foolish, out of place, like a memory from youth I'd forgotten. The next morning, I was up early, trying to shake off the remnants of that strange energy with a brisk walk along the lake. The cool air helped, if only slightly, and by the time I returned, I felt somewhat more like myself. I found Marian already awake, coffee in hand, and looking as well-rested as ever. "Morning, Evelyn. Did you sleep well?" she asked, smiling brightly. "Like a rock," I lied, pouring myself a cup. Howard joined us a moment later, giving a polite nod but looking tired, with a touch of dark circles under his eyes. I wondered if he'd slept any better than I had. Breakfast was light, and we made small talk, the three of us slipping back into a comfortable rhythm. Marian was her usual lively self, keeping the conversation going, and I could tell Howard was trying to engage as much as he could. But occasionally I caught his eyes on me. Just a flicker of something there. An unspoken question. Each time I felt a strange thrill, quickly followed by guilt. After breakfast, Marian had errands to run, needing supplies from a nearby town for a work event the following week. Howard and I saw her off, and suddenly it was just the two of us, alone in the house. "Well," I said, feeling awkward, "I guess I should get to those things I've been putting off around here." "I can help," he offered, his tone casual, but his eyes holding a quiet intensity. "If you don't mind, that is." I hesitated. There was no reason for me to turn down his offer. His presence was comforting, even though it left me with an odd, unsettled feeling. "All right, I could use a hand in the garage. There's an old shelf I need moved." We worked in silence, moving boxes and clearing out the clutter. Our conversation started out light. Comments about Marian, about life, about getting older. But soon, the topics turned deeper, to those quiet subjects you only discuss when you're sure no one else is listening. "She and I," he trailed off, wiping his brow. We're fine, but sometimes I wonder if this is all there is. Or if it's just that we're used to each other. He glanced at me as though testing my reaction. I knew I should have brushed it off, offered something neutral and inconsequential. But something about the way he spoke made me want to give more. I know what you mean, I replied, pulling a stray cobweb from a box and looking away. There are times I wonder what my life would have been if I'd made different choices. Maybe something more exciting. But I guess most people think like that, don't they? He chuckled softly, a sound tinged with resignation. Yeah, I think most people do. But it's odd, isn't it? I'm 58 and still wondering if I've lived the life I was meant to. I looked at him, noticing for the first time the weariness in his face, a weight behind his eyes that went deeper than I'd expected. He was still looking at me, his expression softer than usual. There was a long pause as we both sat there, not moving, just watching each other. Howard? I started, not sure where I was going with my words. Evelyn, he interrupted, his voice so soft I almost didn't hear. Last night, I hope I didn't make you uncomfortable. No, of course not, I replied quickly, feeling heat rise in my cheeks. Well, it was unexpected, I suppose. He smiled, looking down, and for a moment, he seemed almost shy. Maybe it's foolish to think about this at our age, but you make me wonder what it would be like if I'd met someone like you years ago. The words hung between us, weighted and dangerous. I knew this was the moment to laugh it off, to steer us back to safe ground. But something inside me resisted, something that had been quiet for years and was now stirring in response to his words. I reached out, touching his hand lightly, feeling the roughness of his skin. We can't change the past, I said, my voice barely a whisper, but sometimes, even a moment like this, it feels like enough, doesn't it? His hand closed over mine, just for an instant, his eyes meeting mine. The room seemed to shrink, the world outside fading away until there was only this moment, hanging between us like the last breath before something irrevocable. And then, with a quiet sigh, he pulled his hand away, breaking the spell. We spent the rest of the day working side by side, not speaking of it again. But the connection we'd shared lingered, a soft ache beneath the surface, unspoken but understood. That evening, after Marian returned, we sat together by the fire in the living room, the three of us sipping on glasses of wine. Marian was animated, telling stories from her day in town, and Howard chimed in, laughing at her stories. His face lit up in a way I hadn't seen earlier. I watched them, feeling a strange mix of emotions, guilt, longing, and an odd relief that Howard seemed happy again, even if just for the moment. It was late when Marian finally excused herself, stretching and yawning. I'm calling it a night, she declared, already headed for the stairs. Tomorrow, maybe we can go down to the farmer's market, Evelyn. I hear they have the best honey and fresh bread. And Howard. She glanced over her shoulder with a grin. Don't stay up too late talking her ear off. Howard laughed, waving her off. Wouldn't dream of it, he replied, but as she left, the silence settled over us once more, thick with things unsaid. I knew I should go to bed too. But part of me resisted, lingering there on the couch, the fire casting shadows across the room. It's been a long day, I said softly, more to myself than to him. It has, he agreed, his voice low. He was watching me, his gaze steady, unguarded. But it's been a good day too. We sat there, the air between us heavy and charged, until he reached over, brushing a strand of hair from my face. It was such a simple gesture, so gentle that I barely registered it at first. But then, his hand lingered on my cheek, his thumb brushing my skin in a way that sent a thrill through me. Evelyn, he murmured, his voice soft, almost hesitant. I don't know if this is a mistake, but... I didn't let him finish. I didn't want him to. In that moment, all my reservations, all my guilt, melted away as I closed the distance between us, our lips meeting in a tentative, hesitant kiss. It was warm and soft, filled with a tenderness I hadn't felt in years. When we pulled away, the silence was almost unbearable. I could see the conflict in his eyes, the same emotions that were churning in me, but neither of us spoke. The kiss was brief, a moment of stolen intimacy that neither of us could explain or take back. "Good night, Howard," I whispered, finally breaking the silence. My voice was shaky, but I managed a small smile. "Good night, Evelyn," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper, his gaze lingering on me for a moment longer before he rose and walked away, leaving me alone in the dimly lit room, my heart racing. As I sat there, I felt a mix of emotions I could barely name. Joy, fear, guilt, and an undeniable sense of longing. What had I just done? And what would happen now? I didn't have any answers, only the knowledge that things would never be the same. The days that followed were a confusing blur of emotions, each moment spent with Marion and Howard carrying the weight of that kiss we'd shared. I found myself constantly on edge, balancing between the familiarity of my friendship with Marion and the new, unspoken connection with Howard. I knew we'd both crossed a line, and yet a part of me couldn't deny the thrill it had awakened. It was as if I'd been living behind glass, watching life pass by, and now suddenly that glass was shattered. The consequences, though, they were waiting. Every time I caught Howard's eye, every lingering touch of his hand reminded me of the risk. Then, one night, that line was crossed further. That evening, Marion had suggested a quiet dinner on the deck. She had an early meeting scheduled the next morning, so after the meal she excused herself early. Howard and I were left outside, the night air cool and laced with the scent of the lake and pine. The sky was clear, a deep indigo sprinkled with stars, and the moon cast a silvery light over the water. We sat side by side in silence, each of us lost in thought, our wine glasses resting between us on the table. The silence felt natural, like an understanding, one of those rare moments when words weren't necessary. Finally, I broke the quiet, feeling the need to address what had been lingering between us. "Howard," I began, searching for the right words, "about the other night. I don't think it was wise." He nodded, though his gaze was still focused on the dark expanse of the lake. "You're probably right," he replied softly. "But it didn't feel like a mistake, Evelyn. Not to me." His words struck me, and I felt myself unable to reply immediately. I could only watch him, his profile lit by the moon, his expression serious and yet gentle. I wanted to argue, to insist that this couldn't happen, but the sincerity in his eyes, the vulnerability, I knew we were both standing at the edge of something we hadn't planned but couldn't ignore. He reached across the table, his hand covering mine. The warmth of his touch was steady, grounding, and I felt the last of my reservations start to crumble. I should have pulled away, walked back into the safety of my house, locked the door behind me. But something held me there, something deeper than mere attraction. It was as if, in that moment, Howard and I both understood each other in a way no one else ever had. Without a word, he leaned closer, his lips brushing mine again, this time slower, softer. It wasn't a kiss of urgency, but one filled with the weight of years, of missed chances, and words unspoken. This kiss felt like both a beginning and an ending, a choice that couldn't be undone. When he finally pulled back, his hand still held mine, and we sat there in silence. We both knew what this meant, that we couldn't go back, couldn't pretend this hadn't happened. And yet, in that moment, neither of us seemed to care about the consequences. We spent the rest of the night talking in whispers, confessing things we'd never shared with anyone. He told me of dreams he'd left behind, of the things he missed, the parts of himself he felt had been lost in the daily routines of life. I shared my own stories, of the solitude that had both comforted and confined me, of the loneliness that no one had ever guessed was there. When we finally parted that night, there was no grand declaration, no promises made. Only the quiet understanding that something had changed, and that we would each have to face it, in our own way, come morning. The next morning was an uneasy one. Marian, oblivious to the undercurrents, greeted us cheerfully and proposed a trip into town to visit the local farmers market. I went along, smiling, nodding, and responding as naturally as I could manage. But inside, my thoughts were racing. What were we doing? Each time Howard and I exchanged glances, my mind flashed back to the previous night, to the conversations and confessions we'd shared. I felt a pang of guilt as Marian looped her arm through mine, laughing as she recounted some anecdote from her work. She trusted me completely, and here I was, hiding the very thing that would break her heart if she knew. By the time we returned home, I was exhausted, emotionally frayed. I retreated to my room for some quiet, trying to gather my thoughts, to make sense of what I was feeling. But the truth was, I couldn't make sense of it. Part of me wanted to end this now, to walk away before things got even more complicated. And yet, another part of me felt alive in a way I hadn't in years. I was startled from my thoughts by a quiet knock at the door. It was Howard. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice low. I nodded, opening the door wider and letting him in. We sat across from each other in the small sitting area, the air thick with things unspoken. He looked at me, his expression conflicted, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. "Evelyn, I don't know what this means," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just know that I haven't felt like this in a long time." I felt a lump form in my throat, and I swallowed hard, trying to keep my emotions in check. "Howard, whatever this is, it's dangerous. We could lose everything if Marian finds out." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know, but pretending this didn't happen, that there's nothing here, that feels impossible too." We sat in silence, the weight of our words settling between us. I wanted to find an easy answer, a way out of this tangled web. But nothing seemed simple anymore. All I knew was that the feelings I had for him, whatever they were, weren't going to disappear. And as much as I wanted to protect my friendship with Marian, I couldn't deny the connection I felt with him. Maybe we just need some time," I suggested finally, feeling the helplessness of my own words. He nodded, though I could see the reluctance in his eyes. "Maybe," he replied, his voice resigned. "But I don't want to hurt you, Evelyn, or Marian. I don't want to hurt anyone." "Neither do I whispered. But as I said it, I knew the damage had already been done. The next day, a tension simmered just beneath the surface. Howard and I moved around each other cautiously, as though we were afraid any small gesture might betray what had passed between us. Marian, though, seemed as oblivious as ever. She was in high spirits, making plans for future visits and talking about places she wanted us all to go together. But that evening, everything changed. It happened so quickly, I barely had time to react. I was in the kitchen, tidying up after dinner, when Marian called my name from the other room, her tone sharper than I'd ever heard. I walked into the living room, wiping my hands on a dish towel, only to find her standing near the sofa, her face a mixture of confusion and anger. She held a small folded note in her hand, the note Howard had slipped to me in a quiet moment that morning. I had tucked it away in my sweater pocket, but must have dropped it without realizing. "What's this?" she asked, her voice cold. My heart pounded as I tried to find the words. "Marian, She held up a hand, silencing me. Her face was flushed, her eyes narrowed as she looked between Howard and me. "I'm not stupid, Evelyn. I see the way you've been acting. Both of you. I never thought." Her voice broke and she shook her head, clutching the note in her fist. Howard stood, trying to approach her, his face stricken. "Marian, it's not what you think," he began, his voice trembling. She laughed, a sound that was both bitter and full of disbelief. "Not what I think. Howard, you've been lying to me. Both of you have. My best friend and my husband." She looked at me then, her expression raw with betrayal. "How could you, Evelyn? How could you do this to me?" I took a shaky breath, my voice barely steady. "Marian, I never meant to hurt you. I don't know what to say. I'm so sorry." Her eyes filled with tears, and she took a step back, as though my words had only deepened her hurt. I trusted you, Evelyn. I trusted both of you. But clearly, I was a fool. She turned away, gathering her things in a daze, her movements quick and tense. I can't stay here, she muttered, almost to herself. I need to leave. Howard tried to stop her, reaching out, but she pulled away, her face set in grim determination. Don't, just don't, she whispered, her voice barely holding back the tears. Without another word, she left, the front door closing behind her with a final, heavy thud. Howard and I stood in the empty room, the silence pressing down on us, the enormity of what had just happened settling like a weight in the pit of my stomach. The next few days were a blur. Marian didn't answer my calls or messages, and the reality of the situation began to sink in. My best friend, the person I had known nearly my whole life, was gone, and there was nothing I could do to fix it. The hurt in her eyes haunted me, and the guilt gnawed at me constantly. Howard, too, was distant, lost in his own regret. We spoke little, each of us grappling with the consequences of our choices. In the evenings, he sat quietly on the deck, staring out over the lake, his face shadowed with remorse. I knew he felt the same weight of guilt, but his silence made it all the more unbearable. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I finally approached him, needing to break the silence between us. Howard, we need to talk. We can't go on like this, pretending it didn't happen. He looked at me, his face weary, his eyes heavy with regret. I know, he said quietly, but I don't know what to do, Evelyn. I've lost her. I've lost everything. His words pierced me, filling me with a fresh wave of guilt and sorrow. I know we can't change what happened, but maybe it's best if we go our separate ways. He nodded slowly, as though he'd known this all along. You're probably right, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Maybe we both need time, away from each other, to figure out what this all means. We sat together in silence, watching the last light fade over the lake, knowing that this was goodbye. In that moment, I understood that while we had shared something real, something that had meant something to both of us, it wasn't enough to overcome the pain we'd caused. The next morning, Howard packed his things and left, leaving only a quiet emptiness behind. The weeks that followed were filled with emptiness and reflection. I spent long days by the lake, alone with my thoughts, reliving every moment, every decision that had led to this. I had lost not only Marian, but also the fragile connection I'd felt with Howard. And for what? A moment of stolen intimacy? A brief respite from loneliness? As the days passed, I began to accept the reality of my choices. I had betrayed someone who trusted me completely, someone who had been a constant in my life through every hardship. I knew that no apology would ever be enough to repair the damage I'd done, but I also knew that I couldn't live in regret forever. One afternoon, I took a long walk through the woods surrounding my home, letting the quiet soothe my thoughts. I thought of Marian, of the friendship we'd shared, and the memories we'd created over the years. I realized that while I might never have the chance to make things right with her, I could at least strive to live in a way that honored what we'd once shared. It was time to let go, to forgive myself and move forward. There was no going back to the life I'd known, but perhaps with time, there could be something new. Something built on honesty and self-acceptance. Months later, I received a letter. It was from Marian. My hands trembled as I opened it, unsure of what I would find. The letter was brief, her words carefully chosen. She wrote that while the pain of betrayal would take time to heal, she understood that we were all human, capable of making mistakes. She didn't forgive me, not fully, but she wished me peace. She hoped I would find a way to live without the burden of guilt. Her words were bittersweet, but they held a glimmer of hope. I took a deep breath, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders. It wasn't forgiveness, not entirely, but it was a beginning, a small step toward healing. As I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer, I realized that while I couldn't undo the past, I could choose how to move forward. I would carry Marion's words with me, a reminder of the cost of my choices, and the importance of honesty, of loyalty, and of the quiet courage it takes to live a life without regrets. In the end, that brief connection with Howard, however intense, had faded, but the lesson it left was one I would carry for the rest of my days. I had learned about the fragility of trust, the weight of desire, and the unrelenting need for forgiveness, not only from others, but from myself. And so I stepped out into the morning light, feeling the warmth of the sun on my face, ready to embrace whatever the future held, knowing that I would move forward one step at a time.